Why do people in Latin America have so much more indigenous DNA, on average, than people in the US and Canada? Spain and Britain weren't playing the same game when they colonized the Americas. Spain's main goal was to extract riches from the colonies. To do this, they exploited indigenous populations for labor and taxes. Most settlers were men, and they took indigenous women as partners, often by force, producing mestizo populations and reshaping society. The British also used violence and displacement against indigenous peoples, but their primary focus was securing land for settlers and building self-reproducing colonies, rather than integrating indigenous populations. These different strategies are why the Americas look the way they do today. Before Spain began colonizing the Americas, the Iberian Peninsula had been shaped by centuries of foreign rule. The Romans controlled the peninsula from roughly 200 BCE to 400 CE. Roman rule influenced language, law, religion, and culture, integrating local elites and communities into a single political and social system. This integration made the people of the peninsula feel connected to the Roman Empire, which made them less likely to rebel and created a stable, enduring system of control. Later, the Moors ruled parts of the peninsula. They allowed local populations to maintain their own languages, religions, and cultural practices, so many Iberians never felt loyal to the Moors. This lack of integration made Moorish rule more fragile and contributed to their eventual expulsion. From these experiences, the Spanish learned that to maintain control in the Americas, they needed to eliminate local languages, religions, and cultural practices, creating new loyalties to the crown and reducing the likelihood of revolt. Like the Romans had done in Iberia centuries earlier, the Spanish imposed language, religion, and social systems to maintain authority and integrate populations into colonial society. They also used encomiendas and repartimientos to extract labor and tribute, and the mission system helped enforce religion and governance. Where indigenous populations were insufficient or had been heavily reduced by disease or warfare, the Spanish brought African slaves to maintain labor for agriculture and mining, integrating them into colonial economies alongside indigenous labor. Britain approached colonization very differently. Unlike Spain, Britain did not come to the Americas to govern and tax large indigenous populations. Their primary goal was land for settlers, farms, and self-reproducing colonial societies. British colonies were built around families, not administrators. Settlers brought women, established permanent communities, and expected to reproduce European society overseas. Because Britain did not rely on indigenous labor to extract wealth, indigenous peoples were not incorporated into colonial society. They were treated as external obstacles to settlement. Colonial society was structured to keep indigenous peoples outside of it, a system closer to segregation than integration. To meet labor demands, especially after indigenous populations were displaced or destroyed, British colonies turned to African slavery. Enslaved Africans were forced to clear land, work plantations, and sustain colonial economies, while indigenous peoples were excluded rather than absorbed. Violence, disease, displacement, and enslavement shaped British colonies. But unlike in Spanish colonies, indigenous survivors were rarely incorporated into colonial society. These strategies produced very different outcomes. In the Caribbean, the Taíno were placed into encomiendas and subjected to forced labor, violence, and conversion. Their political systems collapsed, but they did not disappear. Survivors were incorporated into colonial society, and Taíno ancestry persisted through mixed populations, which is why indigenous ancestry remains visible in Puerto Rico today. In Mexico, the Aztec were a large, centralized society. Spanish rule adapted existing tribute systems, co-opted indigenous elites, and imposed Catholicism and Spanish language. Indigenous peoples were forcibly integrated into colonial society, producing large, mixed populations that still shape Mexico. Now compare this to British North America. In Virginia, the Powhatan Confederacy occupied land the British wanted. Rather than integrate them, the British seized land through treaties, warfare, and expansion. Powhatan communities were fragmented, displaced, or destroyed. Further north and west, nations like the Cherokee adopted agriculture, centralized governance, and even Christianity. But as settler populations grew, land remained the priority. Integration was never the goal. Removal was. Across the Americas, these patterns repeat. Spanish colonies were built on forced incorporation. Indigenous peoples were enslaved, exploited, taxed, converted, and pushed into colonial society. Language, religion, and culture were imposed to create governable populations. Sexual coercion and forced unions produced mixed populations that reshaped Latin American societies and ancestry. British colonies were built on exclusion. Indigenous peoples were pushed out, segregated, or destroyed to make room for settlers. Labor was supplied primarily through enslaved Africans, while indigenous peoples were kept outside colonial society altogether. Both systems were violent. Both relied on coercion, exploitation, and slavery. But they produced very different societies.